The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite, the ground trembling under the boots of retreating soldiers. It was May 1940, and France was crumbling. In a makeshift hospital near Dunkirk, a group of British nurses from the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service moved through the chaos with practiced calm. Their khaki uniforms were stained with blood and mud, their faces taut with exhaustion. Among them was Margaret Ellis, 24, a nurse from Liverpool with steady hands and a sharp tongue, who bandaged wounds as shells screamed overhead. Beside her was Evelyn Carter, a soft-spoken 22-year-old from Devon, her blonde hair tucked under a cap, her eyes scanning the rows of wounded soldiers on stretchers. The hospital, a converted schoolhouse, was a frenzy of shouts and clattering metal. Wounded Tommies groaned on the floor, their uniforms torn, their faces gray. Outside, German tanks rumbled closer, their engines a low growl that drowned out the cries of the injured. Margaret knelt beside a young private, his legs shattered, whispering, "Hold on, lad. We'll get you through." Her hands worked quickly, tying a tourniquet, but her eyes flicked to the windows, where flashes of artillery lit the dusk. Evelyn, distributing water from a dented canteen, caught Margaret's glance. "They're close," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the din. The nurses had been in France for months, part of the British Expeditionary Force sent to bolster the Allies. They'd seen the war's brutality up close, shrapnel wounds, gas burns, men crying for mothers who'd never come. But nothing prepared them for this collapse. The order to evacuate came too late. As British and French troops scrambled toward the beaches of Dunkirk, the hospital was overrun. German soldiers, their gray uniforms stark against the smoke, stormed the building. Rifles pointed. Voices barked in guttural commands. Margaret froze, a syringe still in her hand. Evelyn clutched a bandage roll, her knuckles white. "Raus! Schnell!" a German officer shouted, gesturing toward the door. The nurses were herded outside, their arms raised, their medical kits scattered on the floor. Wounded soldiers tried to stand to shield them, but bayonets gleamed, and the men fell back. Margaret's heart pounded as she stepped into the cool night air, her boots sinking into the mud. Evelyn whispered, "Stay together," her voice trembling but firm. The nurses, 12 in all, were lined up against the schoolhouse wall. A young German soldier, barely older than Evelyn, stared at them, his rifle shaking slightly. Margaret met his gaze, her chin lifted defiantly. She expected bullets. Instead, the officer barked another order, and they were marched toward a truck. The journey was a blur of jolting roads and distant explosions. The nurses sat in the truck's open bed, guarded by 2 Germans who smoked and spoke in low tones. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap, her mind racing. She'd heard stories of what happened to captured women, tales of brutality whispered in training camps. Evelyn, beside her, clutched a small silver cross necklace, her lips moving silently. The other nurses sat in tense silence, their faces pale under the moonlight. The truck stopped at a railway siding, where a train waited, its wooden cars scarred and weathered. The nurses were pushed aboard, the doors slamming shut with a hollow thud. Inside, the car was cramped, smelling of damp wood and oil. The nurses sat on the floor, their backs against the walls, as the train lurched forward. Margaret pulled a small notebook from her pocket, a habit from her training days, and scribbled by the dim light seeping through a crack. May 28, 1940. Captured. Don't know where we're going. The lads we left behind, God help them. She tucked the notebook away, her hands shaking. Evelyn leaned close, her voice a whisper. They'll treat us as prisoners of war, won't they? Under the rules? Margaret didn't answer. She didn't know. The train rattled through the night, passing fields and villages scarred by war. Burned-out houses flickered past, their windows black. The nurses huddled for warmth, their breath visible in the chill. A nurse named Clara, a stern woman in her 30s from Manchester, spoke up. "They can't shoot us. We're nurses." The Geneva Convention. Her voice cut off as a guard pounded the door, shouting for silence. The women fell quiet, but Clara's words lingered, a fragile hope. Days blurred into nights. The train stopped at sidings to load more prisoners. Allied airmen, French infantrymen, their faces hollow with defeat. The nurses shared their meager rations, a few crusts of bread, and a tin of watery soup. Margaret tore her bread into small pieces, forcing herself to eat slowly. Evelyn, her hands trembling, passed her share to a young airman whose arm was in a sling. "You need it more," she said softly. He took it, his eyes wet with gratitude. When the train finally stopped, the nurses were marched out into a gray dawn. A sign read Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Germany. Barbed wire loomed ahead, glinting in the morning mist. Guard towers stood like sentinels, their machine guns trained downward. The nurses were led through gates, past rows of wooden barracks, to a small compound separated from the main camp. German officers, their uniforms crisp, barked orders. The women were counted, their names recorded on clipboards. Margaret stood tall, her voice steady as she gave her name and rank. Evelyn's voice wavered, but she followed suit. The compound was sparse, a few barracks, a latrine, a small yard enclosed by wire. The nurses were given thin blankets and assigned bunks. Margaret sat on hers, the wood creaking under her weight. She looked at Evelyn, who was staring at the barbed wire outside. "This is it then," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible. "Prisoners." Margaret nodded, her jaw tight. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew they'd face it together. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the camp, the nurses braced themselves for a new kind of war, one fought not with bandages and syringes, but with courage and endurance. The first weeks in Stalag Luft III were a test of survival. The nurses' compound, a small corner of the sprawling camp, was a world of gray wood and gray skies. The barracks smelled of damp pine and mildew, the bunks stacked so close that elbows brushed during the night. Margaret woke each morning to the clang of a bell, her breath visible in the cold. The nurses lined up in the yard for roll call, their khaki uniforms replaced by ill-fitting gray smocks issued by the Germans. Evelyn's smock hung loose on her slight frame, her crossed necklace tucked beneath the collar. The camp was a city of captives, thousands of Allied airmen packed into barracks, their voices a low hum beyond the wire. The nurses' compound was isolated, a precaution, the guard said, to protect them. Margaret scoffed at the word, muttering to Evelyn, "Protect us from what?" "Their own men." But the isolation was a relief in its own way. The nurses heard stories from the airmen's camp, tunnels dug under barracks, escapes planned in whispers. They wanted no part of it. Their war was about survival, not defiance. The Germans assigned them duties in the camp hospital, a low building with cracked windows and a leaking roof. The nurses worked under the watchful eyes of German medics, treating Allied prisoners, mostly airmen with broken bones, frostbite, or infections from wounds poorly tended during capture. Margaret moved through the ward with quiet efficiency, cleaning wounds with boiled water and scraps of bandage. Evelyn, gentler, lingered with patience, offering smiles that seemed to ease their pain more than medicine. Clara, the stern nurse from Manchester, took charge, organizing the others with a drill sergeant's precision. Supplies were scarce. The hospital had no morphine, only aspirin tablets that crumbled to dust. Bandages were reused until they frayed. The nurses improvised, tearing their own smocks for dressings, boiling rags to sterilize them. Margaret's hands grew raw from scrubbing, her knuckles cracking in the cold. One day, a German medic, a wiry man named Hans with tired eyes, slipped her a small bottle of antiseptic. "For the bad wounds," he said in halting English, glancing over his shoulder. Margaret took it, her fingers brushing his, and nodded. She didn't trust him, but she didn't refuse the gift. Food was another battle. The nurses received daily rations, a slice of black bread, a thin soup of cabbage and potato, sometimes a sliver of sausage. It was more than many had eaten in France, but it was never enough. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, a constant ache. Evelyn, always thin, grew thinner, her cheeks hollowing. Margaret caught her hiding bread under her bunk, saving it for worse days. "Eat it now," Margaret urged, her voice sharp. "You'll collapse if you don't." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes distant. "I'm saving it for when it gets bad." The nurses bonded over small acts of defiance. They whispered in English during roll call, knowing the guards couldn't understand. They shared stories of home, Margaret's bustling Liverpool docks, Evelyn's quiet Devon village, Clara's smoky Manchester pubs. At night, they sang softly, hymns or music hall tunes, their voices barely audible over the wind rattling the barracks. One nurse, Lily, a fiery 26-year-old from London, taught them a bawdy song about a sailor, drawing giggles that felt like rebellion. But the camp was not without cruelty. The guards, mostly older men or wounded veterans, varied in temperament. Some ignored the nurses, others leered. One, a stocky sergeant with a scarred face, barked orders in broken English, his hand lingering too long when he pushed them into line. Margaret stared him down, her eyes cold, until he looked away. Evelyn trembled after such encounters, her fingers clutching her cross. Clara, ever practical, whispered, "Keep your head down. They want a reaction. Don't give it." The nurse's greatest challenge was the patience. Airmen arrived in waves, some barely alive, their bodies broken by crashes or capture. Margaret stitched a pilot's gashed arm, his teeth gritted as he muttered, "You're an angel, miss." She shook her head, focusing on the needle. Evelyn sat with a young gunner, his leg amputated, reading him letters from a tattered Red Cross parcel. His eyes followed her, grateful but haunted. The nurses became their lifeline, a reminder of home in a place designed to strip it away. One evening, as snow dusted the yard, Hans, the German medic, approached Margaret again. He held out a small tin of condensed milk, a treasure in the camp's economy. "For the sick ones," he said, his voice low. Margaret hesitated, suspicion tightening her chest. "Why?" she asked. Hans shrugged, his face unreadable. "I have a sister. She's a nurse, too. In Berlin." He walked away before she could respond. That night, the nurses shared the milk, a teaspoon each, its sweetness almost painful on their tongues. Evelyn wrote in her own small diary, a scrap of paper tucked in her smock. "A German gave us milk today. I don't understand." The nurses began to notice cracks in the enemy's facade. Some guards, like Hans, showed fleeting kindness, a cigarette shared. A blind eye turned to a smuggled letter. Others were stone, their faces blank as they patrolled. The nurses learned to read them, to navigate the unspoken rules of captivity. Margaret kept her notebook hidden, scribbling each night. December 12, 1940. A guard let us keep a candle past curfew. Another shouted at Lily for singing. They're not one thing or another. The contradictions gnawed at her, as did the hunger, the cold, and the fear that home was slipping further away. As winter deepened, the nurses clung to routine. They worked, they ate, they slept. They patched wounds and whispered encouragement. But beneath it all, a question grew, unspoken but heavy. How long could they endure? And what did it mean to survive in a place where the enemy could be both cruel and kind? Margaret lay awake, staring at the barracks ceiling, her notebook pressed against her chest. She didn't know the answers, but she knew they'd have to find them together. Spring crept into Stalag Luft III like a reluctant guest, the snow melting into mud that clung to the nurses' boots. The compound's barbed wire glistened under a weak sun, and the air carried the faint sweetness of thawing earth. Margaret Ellis stood in the hospital ward, her hands red from scrubbing bandages in cold water. The ward was quieter today, the latest batch of wounded airmen stabilized, their groans replaced by low murmurs. Evelyn Carter moved among them, her smock patched at the elbows, distributing aspirin tablets from a nearly empty jar. Clara, the Manchester nurse, counted supplies in a corner, her lips pursed as she tallied scraps of gauze. The nurses had settled into a rhythm, their days defined by roll call, hospital shifts, and the endless fight against hunger. The rations hadn't improved, black bread, watery soup, the occasional sliver of cheese, but they'd learned to stretch them. Margaret broke her bread into precise pieces, eating half and tucking the rest into her bunk for later. Evelyn still hoarded crumbs, her eyes darting guiltily when caught. Lily, the Londoner, made a game of it, trading morsels for stories or songs, her laughter a rare spark in the gray monotony. The hospital was their battlefield now. The German medics, understaffed and overworked, relied on the nurses more than they admitted. Margaret noticed Hans, the wiry medic who'd given her antiseptic, lingering near her station. His English had improved, his sentences less halting. One morning, as she cleaned a pilot's infected wound, Hans handed her a roll of clean bandage, a rarity in the camp. "From the Red Cross," he said, his voice low. Margaret took it, her fingers brushing his again, and nodded. She didn't thank him, she couldn't, but the gesture lodged in her mind like a splinter. The nurses' compound was a world apart from the airmen's camp, but news trickled through. The men were restless, digging tunnels, forging papers, planning escapes that rarely succeeded. The nurses heard of failed attempts, prisoners shot in the woods, others dragged back to solitary. Clara shook her head when the stories reached them. "Fools," she muttered. "They'll get us all punished." Margaret disagreed, silently. She admired the airmen's defiance, even if it was reckless. It reminded her of the lads in Dunkirk, fighting to the last. But defiance came at a cost. One evening, after a botched escape, the guards stormed the nurses' compound, their boots pounding the muddy yard. The stocky sergeant with the scarred face, whom they called Scar for his cruelty, shouted orders in German. The nurses were lined up, their breath clouding in the dusk. Scar paced before them, his eyes narrowed. "You know of tunnels?" he demanded in broken English, his voice sharp. Margaret stood rigid, her heart racing. Evelyn's hands trembled, her cross necklace glinting under her smock. No one spoke. Scar grabbed Lily by the arm, his grip tight. "You. Speak." Lily's eyes flashed, but she stayed silent. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're nurses. We know nothing of tunnels." Scar glared, then released Lily, spitting on the ground. The nurses were sent back to their barracks, but the air felt heavier, the wire tighter. That night, Margaret wrote in her notebook, her pencil scratching in the dim candlelight. March 15, 1941. "They think we're part of their schemes. We're not. But I wish I had their courage." She paused, glancing at Evelyn, who was praying softly, her lips moving over the cross. Margaret envied her faith, its quiet certainty. Her own belief had frayed in France, worn thin by blood and bombs. She closed the notebook, her thoughts tangled. The next day, Hans approached her in the hospital, his face tense. "Be careful," he whispered, handing her a small vial of iodine. "The commandant is watching your group. Escapes make them angry." Margaret took the vial, her eyes searching his. "Why tell me?" she asked. Hans hesitated, then said, "My sister. She wrote to me. Berlin is burning. I don't want more blood." He walked away, leaving Margaret staring at the vial, its amber liquid catching the light. She didn't know if it was a warning or a plea, but it unsettled her. The nurses' work grew harder as spring brought more prisoners. Airmen arrived with frostbitten feet, their toes black and swollen. Margaret and Evelyn worked late, draining abscesses, stitching wounds with thread that snapped under pressure. Clara barked orders, her voice hoarse, while Lily hummed to keep spirits up. The patients clung to them, their gratitude a heavy weight. A young pilot, his face burned from a crash, grabbed Evelyn's hand as she changed his dressing. "You're why I'm still here," he said, his voice cracking. Evelyn smiled, but her eyes were wet. Later in the barracks, she whispered to Margaret, "I don't feel like an angel. I feel like a fraud." The nurses began to notice changes in themselves. Their hands grew calloused, their faces thinner, but their spirits held. They shared stories to stay sane, Margaret's tales of Liverpool's docks, Evelyn's memories of Devon's cliffs, Lily's stories of London's dance halls. Clara, usually stoic, spoke once of her husband, a soldier missing since Norway. The confession silenced the barracks, the weight of her loss a reminder of their own. One afternoon, a Red Cross parcel arrived, a rare gift. The nurses crowded around, tearing it open. Inside were tins of sardines, a bar of soap, and a single chocolate bar. They divided it carefully, each taking a square. Evelyn savored hers, her eyes closed, as if it were a prayer. Margaret bit into hers, the sweetness sharp against the camp's bitterness. She wrote that night, "A taste of home, but it hurts more than it helps. Home feels like a dream. The guards, too, were changing. Hans's kindness became a pattern, extra bandages, a smuggled apple, a nod when they sang past curfew. Other guards softened, some offering cigarettes or turning a blind eye to small infractions. But Scar remained a shadow, his presence a reminder that kindness was not the rule. The nurses learned to navigate this fractured world, balancing gratitude with caution, survival with pride. As spring bloomed beyond the wire, Margaret looked at the muddy yard, the barbed wire, the faces of her sisters in arms. They were still prisoners, but they were something more, keepers of hope in a place designed to crush it. By summer 1941, Stalag Luft III buzzed with tension. The airmen's escapes had increased, and the Germans tightened their grip. Searchlights swept the camp at night, guards patrolled with dogs, and roll calls grew longer, the nurses standing in the sweltering yard as Scar barked names. Margaret's smock clung to her skin, sweat beading on her forehead. Evelyn stood beside her, her crossed necklace hidden, her eyes fixed on the ground. The nurses felt the camp's mood shift, a storm brewing behind the wire. In the hospital, work was relentless. The ward overflowed with new prisoners, Canadian pilots, Australian gunners, their bodies battered from crashes or capture. Margaret stitched a navigator's scalp, her fingers steady despite the heat. Evelyn bathed a feverish airman, her hands gentle as she whispered reassurances. Clara, ever the organizer, rationed their dwindling supplies, her face lined with worry. Lily tried to lighten the mood, singing a tune from a London review, but even her voice faltered under the strain. Hans remained their quiet ally. One morning, he slipped Margaret a small packet of sulfa powder, a miracle drug for infections. "Hide it," he whispered, his eyes darting to the door. Margaret tucked it into her smock, her heart racing. She didn't ask where he got it, stolen, perhaps, from German supplies. Later, she used it on a pilot with a festering leg wound, watching the infection recede like a tide. The pilot grabbed her hand, his voice hoarse. "You saved me." Margaret shook her head, thinking of Hans. She didn't understand his motives, but she couldn't deny his help. The nurses began to see the guards differently. Hans wasn't alone in his small kindnesses. A young guard, Carl, barely 19, started slipping them extra bread during roll call, his face flushed with nervousness. Another, an older man with a limp, let them keep a candle burning late, pretending not to notice. But Scar's cruelty balanced the scale. One afternoon, he caught Evelyn lingering too long with a patient, reading a letter aloud. He grabbed her arm, dragging her to the yard, shouting, "No coddling." Margaret stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "She's doing her job." Scar's eyes narrowed, but he released Evelyn, muttering in German. The nurses returned to the barracks shaken, Evelyn's arm bruised, her crossed necklace clutched tightly. The prisoner's defiance inspired the nurses, even as it frightened them. One night, an airman whispered to Margaret in the hospital, "We're digging again. If we get out, we'll take word of you to England." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. She didn't believe they'd succeed, but the thought of home, a Liverpool pub, her mother's voice, stirred something deep. She wrote in her notebook, June 22, 1941, "They dream of escape. I dream of surviving." The nurses' own acts of resistance were quieter. They smuggled bandages to the airmen's camp, hidden in laundry baskets. Lily taught the others to hide messages in their smocks, stitching notes into seams for prisoners to pass on. Evelyn, despite her fear, began slipping extra food to the sickest patients, her hands trembling as she hid bread in her sleeves. Clara disapproved, muttering about risks, but didn't stop them. The nurses were bound by an unspoken pact. They'd do what they could, no matter the cost. One evening, a new prisoner arrived, a British pilot named Tom, his face swollen from a beating. Evelyn tended him, her hands shaking as she cleaned his wounds. He whispered, "I saw London last month." Still standing. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her fingers pausing on the bandage. Margaret overheard, her heart twisting. She hadn't had a letter from home in months. The Red Cross parcels were rare now, the chocolate and soap a distant memory. Hunger was a constant companion, their bodies thinning, their smocks hanging loose. Hans's kindness grew bolder. One night, he left a small sack of potatoes outside the hospital. No note, no explanation. The nurses cooked them in secret, boiling them in a tin over a smuggled candle. The smell filled the barracks, a fleeting warmth. Evelyn savored her share, her eyes closed, whispering, "Like home." Margaret wrote, "Potatoes from a German. I don't know what to think anymore." The act was a crack in the wall between captor and captive, a reminder that humanity could pierce even war's armor. But the camp's tension snapped one morning. An escape attempt failed, 2 airmen shot in the woods. The commandant ordered a lockdown, the nurses confined to their barracks for days. Scar patrolled outside, his boots crunching on gravel, his voice a low growl. The nurses sat in the dim light, their rations cut to a single slice of bread. Evelyn prayed, her cross pressed to her lips. Lily tried to sing, but her voice broke. Margaret scribbled, July 10th, 1941. They punish us for others' courage. I'm angry, but I'm proud. When the lockdown lifted, the nurses returned to the hospital, their hands shakier, their eyes hollow. Hans met Margaret's gaze, his face apologetic. He slipped her a bandage roll, whispering, "I'm sorry." She took it, her fingers lingering on his. For the first time, she saw him not as a guard, but as a man caught in the same war. The realization unsettled her, a betrayal of the hatred she clung to. As summer faded, the nurses stood at roll call, their smocks patched, their faces lined, but their spirits unbroken. They were prisoners, but they were nurses, and that was a power no wire could contain. Autumn 1941 brought a chill that seeped into the bones. Stalag Luft III's compound was a patchwork of mud and frost, the barracks creaking under gusts of wind. Margaret stood in the hospital, her breath visible as she stitched a gunner's frostbitten hand. The ward was crowded, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and unwashed bodies. Evelyn moved silently, changing dressings, her cross necklace tucked away to avoid Scar's wrath. Clara counted their dwindling supplies, her face a mask of frustration. Lily hummed softly, her voice a thin thread of defiance. The nurses had grown leaner, their smocks hanging like sacks. Hunger was a constant shadow, their rations now a sliver of bread and a soup so thin it was barely more than water. Yet they worked on, driven by duty and the gratitude in their patients' eyes. A young Australian pilot, his arm broken, whispered to Evelyn, "You're keeping us alive." She smiled, but her hands shook as she adjusted his sling. Margaret overheard, her chest tightening. They were saving lives, but at what cost to their own? Hans's acts of kindness continued, small but steady. A tin of jam, a handful of bandages, a whispered warning about Scar's patrols. Margaret accepted each gift with a nod, her suspicion softening but never gone. One morning, as she cleaned a wound, Hans lingered, his face drawn. "My sister," he said, his voice low. "She's dead. Bombing in Berlin." Margaret froze, the bandage in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, the word strange on her tongue. Hans nodded and walked away, his shoulders slumped. That night, Margaret wrote, October 3rd, 1941. Hans lost his sister. I said I was sorry. Why did I say that? The nurses began to see the guards as individuals, not a monolith. Carl, the young guard, shared stories of his village, his face lighting up when he spoke of his mother's cooking. The older guard with the limp, whom they called Fritz, told Evelyn about his son, drafted to the Eastern Front. These glimpses of humanity were disorienting, like cracks in a wall they'd built to survive. Evelyn confessed to Margaret one night, her voice barely audible. "I prayed for Hans's sister today. Is that wrong?" Margaret didn't answer. She didn't know. The airmen's escapes continued, each failure tightening the camp's grip. One morning, Scar stormed the hospital, accusing the nurses of hiding messages. He tore through their supplies, scattering bandages and vials. Clara stood firm, her voice cold. "We're nurses, not spies." Scar grabbed her arm, but Margaret stepped between them, her eyes blazing. "Leave her." Scar hesitated, then backed off, muttering. The nurses returned to work, their hands shaking, but their resolve hardened. They wouldn't break. The prisoner's gratitude grew heavier. A pilot carved a small wooden cross for Evelyn, his hands trembling from weakness. Another gave Margaret a sketch of Liverpool's docks, drawn from memory on a scrap of paper. "Heard you're from there," he said, his voice hoarse. Margaret tucked it into her notebook, her throat tight. The gifts were small, but they carried the weight of home, of a world beyond the wire. One evening, a Red Cross parcel arrived, a rare burst of hope. The nurses divided it carefully, tins of fish, a bar of soap, a single chocolate bar. They savored the chocolate, each taking a piece, their eyes closing as the sweetness hit. Lily laughed, licking her fingers. Better than a dance hall. Evelyn whispered a prayer of thanks, her cross gleaming. Margaret wrote, "A taste of freedom, but it reminds us how far we are." The nurses' defiance grew subtler. They stitched messages into bandages, passing them to airmen who whispered of tunnels. Evelyn, despite her fear, began hiding food for the sickest patients, her hands swift under Scar's gaze. Clara, the pragmatist, joined in, slipping aspirin into pockets. Lily taught them to sing in code, embedding messages in hymns. The risks were high, but so was their need to fight back, to be more than prisoners. Hans caught Margaret hiding a message one day, his eyes narrowing. She braced for punishment, but he only whispered, "Be careful." He walked away, leaving her shaken. That night, she wrote, "He knows, but he didn't tell." Why? The question haunted her, a reminder that the enemy was not what she'd been taught. As autumn deepened, the nurses stood at roll call, their faces gaunt but defiant. They were captives, but they were nurses, and their work was a rebellion no guard could quell. Winter 1941 was brutal, the cold biting through the barracks' thin walls. Snow piled against the wire, and the nurses' breath hung in clouds during roll call. Margaret's hands cracked from a cold, her fingers stiff as she stitched wounds in the hospital. Evelyn's face was pale, her cross necklace a constant weight against her chest. Clara's voice grew sharper, her patience frayed by hunger and exhaustion. Lily's songs were quieter now, her defiance tempered by the camp's relentless grind. The hospital was a battleground of its own. New prisoners arrived daily, their wounds worse as the war dragged on. Margaret treated a pilot with shrapnel in his chest, his breathing shallow. Evelyn held his hand, whispering prayers as he faded. Clara rationed their last aspirin, her face grim. The nurses worked until their vision blurred, their bodies aching. The patient's gratitude was a lifeline, but it couldn't fill their empty stomachs or warm their frozen hands. Hans's kindness became a quiet constant. A sack of carrots, a vial of antiseptic, a warning about Scar's mood. Margaret accepted each gift with a nod, her distrust warring with gratitude. One evening, he lingered in the hospital, his face drawn. "The war is bad," he said, his voice low. "Russia is eating our men." Margaret didn't respond, but his words echoed her own fears. Her brother, a soldier, hadn't written in months. She wrote that night, December 20th, 1941. "Hans speaks of loss. So do we. Are we so different?" The nurses' defiance grew bolder. They smuggled food to the airmen's camp, hidden in laundry. Lily stitched a map into a bandage, her hand steady despite Scar's patrols. Evelyn, her fear easing, began passing notes during roll call, her cross a talisman against punishment. Clara, once cautious, joined in, her face set. "If we're here, we fight," she said. The nurses' bond was their strength, a sisterhood forged in captivity. But the camp's tension exploded one morning. An escape tunnel was discovered, and the commandant ordered a search. Guards tore through the nurses' barracks, ripping mattresses, scattering blankets. Scar grabbed Evelyn's arm, finding a hidden note in her smock. "Traitor," he shouted, dragging her to the yard. Margaret lunged forward, but Clara held her back. Evelyn stood trembling as Scar barked for solitary. Hans intervened, his voice calm but firm, speaking in German. Scar hesitated, then released Evelyn, his face twisted with rage. She returned to the barracks, her arm bruised, her eyes wet. Margaret wrote, January 5th, 1942. "They almost took her. Hans saved her. I don't understand him." The nurses rallied around Evelyn, their defiance tempered but not broken. They worked harder, their hands steadier, their voices softer. The patients noticed, their gratitude a quiet fire. A pilot carved a tiny nurse's cap from wood for Lily, his hands shaking. Another gave Clara a letter for his wife, to be smuggled out. The nurses took the gifts, their hearts heavy with the weight of trust. One night, a Red Cross parcel arrived, a flicker of hope. Tins of meat, a bar of soap, a single biscuit. The nurses divided it, their fingers trembling. Evelyn savored her biscuit, her eyes distant. Margaret wrote, "A taste of home, but it's not enough." The nurses' bodies were weakening, their faces gaunt, but their spirits held. They were prisoners, but they were nurses, and that was their power. Spring 1942 brought a fragile warmth to Stalag Luft III, the mud drying under a pale sun. The nurses' compound was a patchwork of worn wood and patched smocks, but the air carried a hint of renewal. Margaret stood in the hospital, her hands steadier as she bandaged a pilot's arm. Evelyn moved quietly, her crossed necklace a constant weight, her prayers softer but unbroken. Clara's face was lined, her voice hoarse from barking orders. Lily's songs were fewer, but her eyes still sparked with defiance. The war's tide was shifting, whispers of Allied victories filtering through. The airmen spoke of battles in the Pacific, of German losses in Russia. The nurses listened, their hearts lifting but cautious. Home felt closer, yet impossibly far. Margaret's notebook filled with questions. April 10, 1942. They say we're winning. Will it free us? She didn't know, but the thought kept her going. Hans's kindness grew bolder. A sack of apples, a tin of milk, a whispered warning about a new commandant. Margaret accepted each gift, her gratitude a quiet ache. One morning, he lingered, his face tense. "My brother's gone," he said. "Stalingrad." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "My brother too," she said, the words slipping out. Hans met her gaze, a shared loss bridging the wire. She wrote that night, "We're both broken by this war. How did I not see it before?" The nurses' defiance continued, subtle but steady. They smuggled letters, hid food, stitched messages into bandages. Evelyn, her fear fading, became bolder, passing notes under Scar's nose. Clara organized their efforts, her pragmatism a shield. Lily sang in code, her voice a weapon. The nurses were a unit, their bond unbreakable, their work a quiet rebellion. The patient's gratitude was a lifeline. A pilot gave Evelyn a drawing of her Devon cliffs, his hands weak but steady. Another carved a tiny stethoscope for Margaret, his eyes bright with thanks. The nurses tucked the gifts away, their hearts heavy with hope and fear. Home was a dream, but the patients made it real. One evening, a Red Cross parcel arrived, a burst of light. Tins of fish, a bar of soap, a chocolate bar. The nurses divided it, their hands trembling. Evelyn savored her chocolate, her eyes wet. Margaret wrote, May 15, 1942. A taste of freedom, but it hurts. The nurses' bodies were frail, but their spirits burned. They were captives, but they were nurses, and that was their strength. The camp's tension eased as spring bloomed. Scar's patrols grew lax, his cruelty tempered by rumors of German defeats. Hans and Karl became fixtures, their kindness a quiet rebellion against the war's hate. The nurses began to see them not as enemies, but as men caught in the same storm. It was a dangerous thought, but it took root, a seed of hope in a barren land. By summer 1943, Stalag Luft III hummed with whispers of liberation. The nurses heard of Allied advances, North Africa, Italy, the Eastern Front crumbling. Margaret stood at roll call, her smock patched, her face gaunt but defiant. Evelyn's crossed necklace gleamed, her prayers a quiet anchor. Clara's voice was softer, her eyes distant with hope. Lily sang again, her voice stronger, a spark of rebellion. The hospital was quieter, fewer prisoners arriving as the war shifted. Margaret stitched a wound, her hands steady despite hunger. Evelyn read to a patient, her voice gentle. Clara rationed their last bandages, her face set. The nurses worked on, their bodies frail but their spirits unbroken. The patient's gratitude was a fire, warming them against the cold of captivity. Hans's kindness was a constant now. A tin of meat, a roll of gauze, a nod during roll call. Margaret met his gaze, her gratitude no longer hidden. One evening, he slipped her a letter, his handwriting small. "For your family," he said, "if you get home." Margaret took it, her heart racing. She wrote that night, June 20th, 1943. "Hans gave me hope. I don't know how to carry it." The nurses' defiance was their legacy. They smuggled letters, hid food, sang in code. Evelyn, now bold, passed messages openly, her cross a shield. Clara organized their efforts, her pragmatism a weapon. Lily's songs were anthems, binding them together. The nurses were a sisterhood, their bond forged in fire. One morning, the announcement came. The camp would close. The nurses repatriated under a prisoner exchange. They stood in the yard, their smocks patched, their faces a mix of joy and fear. Margaret clutched her notebook, her heart pounding. Evelyn prayed, her cross gleaming. Clara's eyes were wet, her voice steady. "We made it." Lily laughed, her voice breaking the silence. The journey home was a blur of trains and ships. The nurses guarded, but not cruelly. They sailed across the channel, England's cliffs rising like a dream. Margaret stood on deck, her notebook heavy in her pocket. Evelyn clutched her cross, her eyes wet. The nurses disembarked in Liverpool, their bodies frail, but their spirits whole. Home was real, but it was changed, as were they. Margaret visited her mother, finding her in a bombed-out street, her face lined but alive. Evelyn returned to Devon, her cliffs unchanged but her heart heavier. Clara searched for her husband, her hope fragile. Lily sang in a London pub, her voice carrying the war's weight. The nurses carried Stalag Luft III with them, the hunger, the cold, the kindness of an enemy who became human. Margaret wrote one last entry, August 10th, 1943. "We're home, but we're not free. The war is in us, and so is Hans's soap, his milk, his hope." The nurses stood together one last time, their smocks gone, their bond eternal. They were captives no more, but they were nurses forever, their hearts marked by a war that broke them and made them whole.